Welcome to Mecum Presents On the Move, brought to you by State Farm. It's the show geared toward keeping you up to speed with the latest auto news, event coverage, and expert industry insight. Now, here are your hosts, Matt Avery and John Kraman.
Hey, welcome everyone to another episode of On the Move. I'm Matt Avery, executive producer of The Transmission, and joining me is John Kraman, lead TV commentator for Mecum Auctions. John, today's show has a specific focus, and that is all about restoration.
Yep, you are exactly right, Matt. Very proud to have a couple of very notable guests coming on today. We're going to start out segment 2 with Gary Riley. Gary's name may not be familiar, but he's the boss man at Level 1 Restorations, one of the top restoration shops in the country in the Denver, Colorado area. And then following up is Rick Schmitt. Rick is the VP and COO of National Parts Depot, Mpd. So we're going to hear kind of what's happening currently in the restoration world from a restoration shop and the prominent supplier of restoration parts. It's going to be a great show.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to check in. Gary is also working on a very notable GTO known as the Humbler, so we're going to get a full update from him. Speaking of updates, John, right now, Mecum Auctions has some really exciting news. We are right in the middle of the Davenport Spring Classic auction.
Yeah, Mecum has gone farming, Matt. Spring Classic, Davenport, Iowa this year. Going on as we speak. 500 tractors, 100 vintage trucks, and a lot of what's considered farm relics and road art as well from the farm world. And we did have on one of our shows, we did have Paul Deshenko on to brief us on what was going on and sort of what was happening in the tractor world. And we'll get him back on again to talk about, give us a little recap on what happened to the first Mecum live auction since Glendale car auction back in March. It's been a long haul, but Mecum's back in business, man.
And I like how you said we have gone farming indeed. Now, from farming, let's turn our attention to some latest car news. It seems like it's been a long process, but finally we are getting closer to the Ford Broncos unveiling. Ford has made the announcement that will now be happening in July.
Yep, the hard date that has been announced, Matt, officially is July 9th, and that's a big deal because this is probably the most anticipated new vehicle launch since the C8 Corvette last year. I'm not exaggerating. The popularity of vintage Broncos is legendary. We've talked about it on the show here, and we'll continue to talk about that. But this new Bronco is big news. Some of the early rumors, nothing to confirm anything, is that it will be available with a conventional 3-pedal manual transmission. Again, nothing confirmed on that. A lot of old school Bronco guys are saying sure, it'd be nice if it was a stick as an option available, and so we're gonna be keep an eye on that, as well as upcoming news on the latest Ford pickup truck as well. Lots going on in that world right now.
And Ford is not backing away from the Broncos' capability. Everything that I have seen indicates that they expect it to fully go head-to-head with long-standing icons in that space, the Jeep Wrangler. So it'll be interesting to see if it really does have that off-road chops.
Well, that's a good point, Matt, because the Chevrolet Nemesis, the Blazer nameplate, which for years was a competitor with the Bronco, has gone a little bit of a softer route where it's more of a high-styled crossover than a serious off-road vehicle, much to the dismay of a lot of enthusiasts when we first heard about the Blazer launch a couple of years ago. So it's going to be interesting to see if Ford, in fact, stays with the attitude and the intent of the former Bronco. So far, all indications it is.
John, turning our attention to General Motors, you had heard some news about the future of electric vehicles for them.
Yeah, Mary Barra, the very well-known CEO of General Motors, just has made an announcement within the past week or so that she feels that gas-powered vehicles are going to be around at least until 2040, which kind of is a little bit of a different spin on what General Motors had put out in the past, where they were really on a full court press push for electrification to be being integrated much, much quicker. So I guess that's good news for those of us old school guys that prefer to have a choice. Give us a choice between conventional gasoline-powered vehicles and also a choice between electric. And it looks like they're kind of backing off this, hey, we're going to go all electric here in a few years that we've heard so much about.
Now, John, also with electric vehicles, there's a lot of startups, as people are well aware, kind of moving to fill that gap. One of them is Nikola, and they have shown some more details about their pickup truck.
They have, Matt, and that's probably some of the biggest news now in the electric world is their little pickup truck called the Badger. I think that is going to be the production name. They're going to make a couple different versions of it, an all-electric version, of course, which will be lithium-ion batteries, as is the trend right now. But they've also said hydrogen electric, which is, the power cell, which is potentially a alternative for the future as well. How that works is the hydrogen provides electrical power to electric motors, and it's a little bit difficult to produce and store that hydrogen. They're still trying to kind of work on those details. But if they get that perfected, that may be a great way for people to quickly fill up with hydrogen as opposed to having to charge up the batteries. Anyway, they're going to make a version of each. And they have not yet announced who their manufacturing partner is going to be. I would expect maybe within the next 30 days, we might hear who it might be. I have no idea, no clue, no rumors out there. But it looks like this truck is going to happen, and they're actively working right now on trying to find a producer to actually help them get this truck produced.
And I have to say, John, the truck looks really sharp.
Well, it's a little bit more of the final comment on this, a little bit more of a traditional look than we've seen from the Tesla Cybertruck, which is really space-age, cutting-edge, stealth, kind of crazy looking. This is a little bit more of a conventional appearing truck, but it's not going to be conventional from the powertrain.
Mecum Auctions is proud to bring you On the Move with Matt Avery and John Kraman. For more on the world of collector cars, head over to Mecum.com. Now let's get back to the show.
Our next guest is Gary Riley. Gary is the owner-operator of Level 1 Restoration, located in the Denver, Colorado area. The shop is known the world over for restoring some of the most significant classic and muscle cars of the 1960s and 70s. Gary, it's so great to have you on the show.
Hey, thanks a lot. Appreciate you having me.
Hey, Gary, man, you and I have spent a lot of time at your shop hanging out, talking cars, but take Matt and I right to the beginning. Where did your preoccupation with cars begin?
Well, I grew up in a car family. My dad loved cars from a little kid, even just had a fascination with them. None of his family was into it, so that's a unique thing. So I was around it. He had a lot of neat old cars, had his own body shop when I was a pretty small kid. And then my brother, who's, quite a bit older than me, who got into some GTOs and racing at the drag strip. And so just really caught the bug, from when I was a little kid. So when I moved out to Colorado, I couldn't believe all the awesome cars that were out here that were rust-free, just driving around. Because I was from Illinois originally, and everything was all rusted and, beat up back there. So out here it was just a paradise for me. I was never going to leave. So I just started my journey that took me into owning my own restoration shop. I worked at a couple of shops and car-related, and finally a restoration shop where I worked for 3 years, and then I struck out on my own. And really from that very beginning, my focus was to work on cars that people wanted to take to a show and have it judged, because I was really interested in, exactly how they were made from the factory. So that was 19 years ago this summer, and during that time, I started going to auctions, and that's where, you and I met. Obviously, I think it was at an Indy Mecum auction, I don't know, somewhere in the early 2000s or something like that. But that's kind of the quick history on how I got to Level 1 Restoration.
There have been so many top quality restorations, show-winning restorations that you and your shop are well known for. Is there a couple of them in particular that stand out and you're especially proud of?
Yeah, well, I'd have the one that comes to mind right away would be a 69 Trans Am convertible. As a kid, you would hear about these iconic cars, and I never even imagined I would get to see one, let alone get to totally restore one. So that's a really big one for me. And being a Pontiac guy back then, in particular, a 71 Judge convertible was a really big deal. We've done a couple of those. We did a 40 Packard, which is outside of our normal thing, a Packard Dare, and that was a really fantastic restoration. Love those cars, even though muscle cars are really what we know the most. It was a treat to get to do something, that high-end and handmade, really, alongside of, Yenkos and some of these really fantastic cars. But I would say we just finished up the earliest known Boss 429 Mustang. That was really exciting. We're currently doing the earliest, or the number one Yenko Camaro, so 1967 Yenko Camaro, first invoice car. So that's really exciting. I really like to do cars that were ultra low production, or maybe just one or two made. We did the two Indy 500 pace cars that actually paced the Indy 500 at the 69 Camaros. That was really neat because of the history involved with them. So anything that's really historically significant.
I remember mentioning those two 69 Camaros that paced that great race that Mario Andretti got his only win in. I saw both of those cars last year at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Museum. Both were on display to commemorate Mario's win. And I noticed that one of those cars had Goodyear tires and the other one had Firestone tires. And I guess that's the agreement that the track had made with the tire manufacturers and sponsors back in 1969. Were you aware of that little detail?
Yeah, absolutely. So that was, a major part of the restoration was just finding out all of those pieces of information. And one of our customers was just obsessed with finding out every detail and information. And that customer owns the number 2 car, which has the Goodyear tires on it. And the number 1 car they had held back for the race with the Firestone tires. As it turns out, the number 2 car was photographed so much more than the number 1 car because it was out, for all the pre-race stuff almost for the whole month prior to the race. So when you look back on history, the number 2 car with the Goodyear tires is really, kind of the cooler car in a sense because it is in so many photographs. But other than that, those cars were pretty much identical. With the one interesting footnote was that all of the engine parts would say A or B on them, or number 1 or number 2, and that's engine, transmission, and rear end. But the rear ends were swapped. They accidentally put the number 1 rear end in the number 2 car, and that's how we left it.
Gary, one of the exciting projects that your team is currently working on is the restoration of the 1970 GTO Ram Air 4, known as the Humbler. It's featured in that very iconic Superbowl commercial, and one of just a handful with that VOE option, the vacuum-operated exhaust. John and I saw the car at last year's Muscle Car and Corvette Nationals. What's the latest with that project?
Well, it's, the body is getting pretty close to being done on that car. Really exciting. We're buying a whole entire car to get a set of assembly line VOE mufflers. The only set I know of out there, we've been looking, and I've never even heard. There's a guy that has one. But anyway, so the car is, coming along pretty good. It won't be too long, and it will be in primer. We have a lot of the upholstery. We'll use all new old stock material. We have all of that in hand right now and getting that into the hands of the upholstery shop. The engine is probably 2-3 weeks away from being done. And amazingly, all that stuff's original on that car. It really was remarkable how the guy kept it all in one piece. It really had only one owner until about a year ago.
That car's claim to fame, as Matt had mentioned, Gary, was a very well-known, even though it only aired one time, a commercial, about a 1-minute commercial of a silver 70 GTO with a blue interior cruising through a big boy diner, presumably in Michigan, with a combination of equipment that never made it actually into production. The vacuum-operated exhaust did find its way onto a couple hundred GTOs as a regular option, but they never offered, from the production sheets, a vacuum-operated exhaust with any of the Ram Air engines. Tell us what you know about that story.
Well, the commercial and the option were canceled after the top GM executives saw the commercial. They canceled the commercial and the option because they both promoted racing. If that's true, that's the story that we've been hearing. But then as far as why they didn't have those options, it's because they were both vacuum operated, and in particularly with the Ram Air 4, it didn't produce a lot of vacuum. So I think that probably they were, it may be hit or miss on how it worked on an engine that didn't really produce enough vacuum to maybe open up those mufflers. And they never really worked out how the two levers would interact under the hood. This car did have them. They just kind of overlapped side by side underneath of there. But I think it was mostly a vacuum thing, which I don't know why, it wouldn't have worked with a Ram Air 3 because that would have made plenty of vacuum. But that's pretty much the story that we've been hearing from, all the historians on that reason why they didn't put that VOE setup with Ram Air.
So from a staffing standpoint, to get this car finished from the time it debuted at Mecum in November of 2019 until the reintroduction in a restored condition this year, what type of effort, how much manpower have you got on that car? Is there anything else going on in the shop, or is everybody focused on getting this one done?
No, we actually have 4 cars that will be debuted at Mecum along with the Humbler. So right now, and I have a crew of 7 guys in-house, and then I have a lot of subcontractors. So we do pretty much everything in-house except for the engine machining and the upholstery work. So those 2 things we sub out. So I have 2 guys basically at all times working on that car, not counting the subcontractors. So on any given day, there could be 4 guys on that car. But in addition to that car, we have the first ever Yenko Camaro that's going to be debuted. We have a 69 Hemi Coronet RT convertible 4-speed car that's going to be debuted as well, and a 70 Judge Ram Air 3 car that was bought new out of Canada, and it's now back with the original owner. So we have a huge amount of work on our plate, and we can't even have any shutdowns or, anything else that goes wrong for us to get all this stuff accomplished. So it's kind of a high-pressure situation. Fortunately, I have just an incredible crew of guys that just do amazing work day in and day out.
Gary, you've really piqued my interest with that Yenko. Any light you can shed on that car story?
Yeah, no, that car was sold new over in John's stomping grounds in Rockford, Illinois. It was bought by the dealership from Yenko. The Rockford dealership got it and raced it from about March or April through September, and they had 2 67 Yenkos on their lot, and the original owner went and test drove both of them in the red car, which just so happens, no one cared at the time, that it was, the first one that they made. It was much faster because they'd been racing it all summer, and they in fact had radiused the rear wheel wells already, so when the guy bought the car on the lot, basically a new car to him, it had a few miles on it. It had already been modified like that. An interesting thing about those very first Yenkos is they were SS350 cars, the first maybe 5 or 6 of those cars. So they had to do an extensive amount of conversion. After that, then they mandated that they come with a big block engine, and then ultimately with a 375 horse engine, which made it even easier. But on this car, they had to change the front springs, and it didn't have the big block heater box cover. It had a small block radiator. I mean, it's wildly different than a 68 Yenko or a later 67 Yenko. So very interesting car, which has survived with its engine, transmission, and rear end, amazingly. Survived with all those pieces. So it's a great car.
Gary, with such a passion for cars, what kind of vehicles do you have in your collection?
I have a 70 W30 convertible, which is an automatic car. Just getting that car, I traded it for a Pilot 71 Judge that I had, which is a really cool car. VIN number 19, probably the first 71 Judge made. That was a neat car. And then I had a 67 428 HO Catalina, factory 411 gear, transistorized ignition, disc brakes, 15-inch wheels. I mean, really wild car. I traded those two cars for that 70 W30 convertible. And then on top of that, I've had a 67 GTO that I've had since I was a senior in high school, which my brother bought when I was 8 years old, when he was only 15 years old. So that's been in the family forever. And I have a 67 Firebird 4-speed car. And right now those are, the W30. I got rid of those other two GTOs, and then I have my 267. So currently I like to have a rotation. So the 67 GTO and the 67 Firebird, they kind of stay, and then the other cars will kind of come and go. And it can be any kind of car. I just love any kind of car, so...
Hey, Gary, thanks so much, man, for taking time out of your crazy schedule to spend some time with Matt and I, and we reserve the right to get you back on for updates, especially as we get closer to completion on the Humbler.
Hey, you got it. No problem. Thanks, guys.
Don't adjust that dial. On the Move, we'll be right back. Our program is proudly presented by Mecum Auctions, the world's largest collector car auctions. Now back to Matt and John.
Well, our next guest is Rick Schmitt. Rick is the Vice President and Chief Operating Officer for National Parts Depot. His dad started the company in 1976, and Rick has been working there since 1989. Rick, thanks for stopping by today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Rick, tell us a little bit about how did MPD get started? How did your dad kind of get it off the ground?
My dad always wanted to restore a Model A when he was a kid, so he bought a 1928 Model A for $50 out of an Ohio junkyard, which is where the family lived just south of Cleveland. He set about restoring that car himself while he was still in high school. And just to give you a window inside the mind of my dad and how he worked as a 14-year-old kid, he was disgusted that when he ordered fastener kits from the Model A part suppliers back in the day, and this is 1957, that they were sending him what he considered generic hardware store junk. So my grandfather had a good understanding of all the fastener manufacturers that were in downtown Cleveland, because they actually back in the day fed Detroit a lot of the hardware and fasteners that were used for building Fords. And my dad went into business for himself as a teenager, doing correct fastener kits, restoration kits for Model A Fords, distributed through J.C. Whitney and all sorts of other Model A part suppliers back in the day. So he was doing so well with that, and he also finished the restoration of the Model A while he was in still high school. Bought himself a 1957 Thunderbird that was slightly used in 1959, and he ran that Model A fastener business on nights and weekends while working for my grandfather at his manufacturing company. Fast forward to the mid-70s, my dad got tired of working for my grandfather. They got along, but they didn't get along very well, and he decided he wanted to shoot off on his own. He sold the Model A fastener business and decided that he wanted to sell restoration parts for the little 55 through 57 Thunderbirds, because over the span of all these years, he was one of the founding members of the club, and he knew those cars inside and out and had restored another one. So he started National Parts Depot in the basement of our home in 1976. He built his own wooden shelving in the basement, built himself a work desk, and created his own catalog. And as soon as he realized that business model could pay the family's bills, then he started thinking bigger, because he was like, I don't think I can sell these T-Bird parts forever. What else could I add to the fold that would take me into the future? And his first and what was a very wise choice was he chose the early Mustangs. They were really starting to catch fire. So in 1978, he started construction of a purpose-built building out on I-75 in Gainesville, Florida. Started carrying the muscle car, the Mustang parts. That took off like a rocket. And it's a long story from there, because, man, I'll tell you what, those in the 80s when my dad was traveling the country and he opened up a warehouse, and he was really a pioneer for regionalized distribution warehouses. Back in the 70s, the whole point of mail order was that you just built a big building in the middle of the U.S., close to everybody, and you distributed from there. My dad was the first one in this business to go, no, I want to be a little bit closer to my customers so that the shipping will be faster, and because people tend to buy in a regional nature anyhow. So he opened in California and then Michigan. In the early 90s, we opened up our fourth location in Charlotte. And all along the line, my dad, we started with Ford products, but throughout my life, I know that my father purchased and enjoyed all makes and models of cars. My dad was just a huge car enthusiast. We had GTOs and Rivieras in the family. So we got into Camaro parts and Chevelle parts. Really, when Dad was thinking about what cars to carry parts for, he was thinking about the best return on the investment and the time resources. He wanted to sell parts for very popular cars that were popular to restore and fix up. And that was the thinking that went along with that. To present day, we're up to 12 active catalogs. We sell parts for Ford trucks and Chevy trucks, as well as popular makes and models of Chevrolet, Pontiac, and of course the Mustang parts, and we folded Cougar along with that as well. It's just been a long, wild ride. We've got almost 600,000 square feet of warehouse space now. The car collection, that's a whole different ball of wax. There was never any master plan for that either. It just kind of started, and before we knew it, we had a habit that we had a hard time kicking. A lot of people say, boy, I don't know how you worked for your father over all those years, because a lot of family business, the siblings just don't get along terribly well. But my dad and I seem to mesh very well, where we have different personalities, but then when you combine the two of our attributes together, we're a pretty damn good team.
Rick, from great story, from humble beginnings to today's restoration parts titan, where do you see your company fitting into the mix of the restoration and the collector car business today?
That's a more difficult question than you might imagine. Honestly, back in the 90s, when I thought about where I would be and where NPD would be in 2020, I would have never guessed that we'd still be stroking along as hot and as heavy as we are. And I never would have guessed that we would still be selling parts primarily because we have gotten into some later model parts for the trucks and for Mustangs. But still, the main wheelhouse of NPD is still 50s, 60s, and 70s era, popular American cars. That seems to be the wheelhouse for the hobby still. People, we thought that we had to keep on getting into more modern cars to keep up with the hobby. But as soon as you introduce airbags and computers and 150 pounds worth of expensive wiring harnesses into the equation, things seem to slow down. There's a simplicity and an ease to understand on the car's pre-computer and pre-fuel injection that really seems to keep people going. You can take the car apart, restore it, and put it back together in your garage with some Craftsman tool set and an air compressor. So where we go into the future, I really do think the future is going to be a whole lot of people restoring other people's poor attempts at past restorations. I think a lot of our customers are restoring a vehicle that's been done 3 times over already, and all we do is provide the parts so somebody else can do it again with a different color, and maybe they're doing an LS swap, maybe they are modernizing a little bit. That whole resto mod trend, I don't think it's going to get bigger, because I think as much as people try to modernize cars, you got an equal amount of people who are pulling that out and putting them back to stock, at least the ones that are, valuable models. So it's a wild ride, and then you throw this pandemic into the middle of it, which has actually caused our business to go through the roof. You give a whole lot of car people some time on their hands at home, and they're not, they haven't been idle. They're looking for something to do, and a lot of projects that people have been procrastinating, they're starting to work on. So we've been on the silver lining side of this cloud that's flown over us. Business has just been at breakneck speed ever since all these pandemic shutdowns started.
Well, really glad to hear that things are hanging in there and as strong as ever for you guys. You mentioned earlier your car collection. Let's shift gears now. Tell us a little bit. Give us an overview of what the collection is and what are some of the really great cars and subgroups within that.
There's over 200 vehicles in the collection. I think we're in around 215 right now. It's all with just a few outliers. It's almost all American made. And it's mostly kind of split down the middle, General Motors products and Ford products. We've got a few Mopars in the collection, but I can't tell you why. It's not for lack of not having a ton of different Mopar models that my dad and I admire. Maybe it's because we're so cheap. And the Mopar collectors are a furious bunch to bid against, especially when you've got a really prime example running across the auction block. But it's mostly Ford and GM stuff, and I'll tell you what, we've got cars from the turn of the century, 1903, all the way up through present day. My dad always was attracted to high-end models, top-of-the-line models, hopefully with great colors and good options. He doesn't like the bottom-of-the-line stripper type of muscle cars. Back when I remember when we started collecting Tri-Fi Chevys were just red hot, and you'd have to pay $90,000-$100,000 for a fuel-injected '57 Chevy. Well, back then we were buying just beautiful low-mile '50s Cadillacs for $25-30 grand a pop, and my dad would just say, "Why would I buy a Chevrolet when I can have 3 Cadillacs for the same money?" So we've got a lot of luxury cars in our collection. We've got 70% of the collection is what you would, and we've got some muscle cars too. We've managed to just fill in a whole. It's a very eclectic, strange collection to walk through. A lot of cars that you could go 10 years without seeing another one like it. 70% of it, though, is the low-mile survivors, cars that have never been restored and not in barn-find condition, but cars that were truly lovingly cared for and properly stored by their owners. We've got a lot of cars from the 50s and 60s and 70s here that are virtually brand new, never painted, never reupholstered, never rebuilt mechanically. And I can tell you firsthand that the experience in driving a car from the 60s that only has 5,000 or 6,000 miles on it, or maybe 300 miles on it, even though these were mass production cars, boy, did the factory do a great job of bolting those cars together. It's so hard to replicate the proper function and smoothness and rattle-free condition in a restoration as you get when you have a low-mile survivor.
Well, if listeners want to learn more, head over to npdlink.com. Rick, thanks so much for the insight today.
Rick, thank you so much. And on behalf of the entire collector car world, for everything that you do to keep these cars on the road, thank you so much, my friend.
Thank you. We have fun doing it.
You've been listening to Mecum Presents On the Move, brought to you by State Farm. For more information, visit Mecum.com. And join us again next time as we take you inside the world of muscle and collector cars and more.